Welcome, everyone, and particularly welcome Rick Doblin to this edition of my Friday webinar. I'm Jim Gordon and the founder and executive director of the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. And Rick is the founder and executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, better and more easily known as MAPS. And we're going to be talking about psychedelics, a transcendent path to trauma healing.
Wow.
So welcome, Rick. And first, we're going to begin this session, as we always do, with a couple of minutes of slow, deep breathing. So please join me, Rick, and everyone, just in relaxing, sitting comfortably, breathing slowly and deeply, in through the nose and out through the mouth, with our bellies soft and relaxed. You might want to close your eyes to remove external stimulation. Technically, this is a concentrative meditation, and we're concentrating on the breath coming in through the nose and out through the mouth, on the feeling of relaxation and softness in our bellies, and on the words soft as we breathe in and belly as we breathe out. Relaxing a little more with each exhalation. If thoughts come, let them come, notice them, let them go. Gently bring your mind back to soft belly. Okay, let's open our eyes, let our attention come back in the room. So once again, welcome Rick, welcome everyone who's watching us. Rick Doblin, you have been an amazing force in moving ahead the scientific investigation of psychedelics as therapeutic agents, and also as ways of expanding our consciousness, even if we don't have an immediate problem like post-traumatic stress or depression that we're dealing with, but just opening up our minds as well as opening up our hearts. And we're going to be talking about all the ways that you've done that on the clinical front, on the public policy front, and how you've engaged people in this movement. But before we move into all of that, and into talking about MAPS, which you founded in 1986, I just want to say something somewhat apart from that work, which really struck me about you. I admired what you're doing very much from the time I first heard about it, and then from the time we first talked together. But the other thing that I not only admired, but that deeply touched me, is that you introduced me to some of your funders, not to get funded to do work with you, but to fund the work that we're doing at the Center for Mind-Body Medicine with population-wide psychological trauma. And I was so struck by your generosity
Hmm.
in this world of nonprofits, for one executive director to introduce another to funders who have been important to him and say, please, Jim Gordon's doing great work. I really want you to meet him. I was so touched and so impressed by that spirit of generosity. And I feel that that spirit that you bring is also has been and continues to be so important to people looking seriously, thoughtfully, and openly at the psychedelic possibilities or the possibility of psychedelics. So I want to thank you and salute you for that.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Because I think part of that generosity, you could say, is a sense of what's our real mission. And it's not just to build this narrow nonprofit MAPS, but the mission is this mass mental health and this idea that populations that are suffering from trauma, they have a hard time making peace with their neighbors, making peace with themselves. So I see what the Center for Mind Body Medicine is doing as very consistent with our mission, with our broader mission. And so that's why trying to encourage some of these funders to support you as well. It just seemed part of our mission and our larger work.
Thank you. And I want to come back to that at the end of our talk together this afternoon and talk about both you and MAPS and I and the Center for Mind Body Medicine working together, but also talk about this larger mission, because the time has come for us to come together and to really work together and to see what we're doing, as you do, and I believe I do as well, as different parts, different aspects of the same movement.
Very
But
much.
let me start a little back at the beginning, or close to the beginning. How did you first become interested in psychedelics? I saw you wrote a paper or a thesis in college. And tell us a little bit about the young Rick Doblin.
Yeah, well, really it happened for me in 1972 at 18. And that's when I really decided to devote myself to psychedelics. And how that happened is that I came from a family. My father's hero was Saul Alinsky, the community organizer, and my parents were very progressive in their views. Also, we've had relatives, some Jewish and born in 1953, shortly after World War II. And we've had relatives in Israel or Palestine, you could say, since 1904. And we had relatives that were there during the War of 48, the War of Independence. And so a big part of my education was about the Holocaust as I was a young boy. And that just very much traumatized me secondarily, hearing about it. And, I felt like my parents and my grandparents were, on one side it was my grandparents, on the other side it was my great-grandparents were refugees. And then they came to America and they found freedom and they found opportunity and they were able to succeed. So it's sort of like the American dream. And so I felt like I was a multi-generational product supported by the generations before me to look at deeper threats of anti-Semitism, the irrational taking over. And so it just really scared me thinking about the Holocaust as a young boy. The next kind of trauma, you could say, was around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the idea that we could be in a war with Russia and there could be nuclear weapons. And at school, they were just saying, duck and cover, the whole thing, just go under your desk and maybe you'll survive. And that was scary too. So now it wasn't just the Germans after trying to take over the world and killing particularly the Jews, but it was now, the US and the Russian could blow up the whole world. And then the final sort of trauma for me in that sense was Vietnam, and now it's my own government. And I'm got to be friends with Daniel Ellsberg over the years. And one of the things that he said that so surprised him was that initially he thought that, he was working in national security and, he released the Pentagon Papers. But his initial understanding of Vietnam was that we were on the wrong side of the war.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, he realized that it's not that we were on the wrong side of the war, that we were the wrong side. So it's sort of owning our own domineering impulses. And so all of that just led me to realize that the world was a shaky place. And I believed all the propaganda about LSD and psychedelics, though, that you took it a few times, it made you crazy, and um, chromosome damage and all that. So I was not interested in altered states. I was just very interested in politics and what could be an antidote to all this kind of hatred and cruelty. And so what finally did it, the first sort of crack in the egg, you could say, was that I was studying Russian to learn about the other. I actually spent time as a 16-year-old boy in the summer after my junior year of high school in Russia, studying Russian and learning about Russians. My dad and mom sent me with prayer books to give to the people at the synagogue. So they sent me on an underground mission in Russia while we were doing that, because prayer books were illegal at the time. But there was a kid in my Russian class, a friend of mine, that handed me this book, and he said I would probably enjoy reading it. And so I loved it, and I handed it back to him, and I said, "This was terrific. I really appreciate you giving this book." And he said, "Do you realize that the author wrote some of this book while he was under the influence of LSD?" And I said, "That's impossible. I mean, LSD is a hallucinogen. It's disorienting. Nothing good can come from it." And he said, "No, check it out. It's true." And I did check it out, and it turned out it was true. It was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey.
Yeah.
So that was really the first thing that got in the way of all the propaganda. And when I went to college, then I started thinking maybe I was 17 years old. I went to New College of Florida in Sarasota, and I thought I was ready to start experimenting with LSD. And I had a lot of important experiences with LSD. I was so cognitive that LSD brought me to my emotions. And but I had difficult trips. I had a lot of difficult trips, but I had intimations of kind of ego dissolution and connections with evolution and with all things and all nature. And so this,
Rick, but what led you to take that first trip? What was on your mind? What were you thinking?
well, at this point in time, thank you for saying that, the psychedelic counterculture had crashed and burned. So 1970 was the backlash with Nixon, the Controlled Substances Act. Nixon is the most dangerous man in America. And I was planning also to be a draft resistor, and I was anticipating going to jail. So I was studying nonviolent resistance and Thoreau and Tolstoy and Gandhi and Martin Luther King and all these things. And so I was planning to, I never registered for the draft, and I thought they would catch me and I would go to jail. And so what got me to think about LSD was this thought that people were describing this sense of connection, this sort of mystical, spiritual, beyond the ego kind of states. And once I started experiencing that in little ways, because again, I was very defended and it was difficult, I started getting a feeling like the psychedelic counterculture had crashed and burned, but there was something fundamentally important that needed to be salvaged, which was access to these kind of experiences. And I felt that they would be the antidote to fundamentalism and to dehumanizing others and mass murder and genocide. That if you feel connected to everything, it's harder to be racist or harder to dehumanize others. And I felt that that was sort of the kernel of salvation, you could say, inside the psychedelic counterculture that I think motivated a lot of the psychedelic activists as well, and the environmental movement, the women's rights, Vietnam War protests, civil rights even. So I had a bunch of psychedelic experiences that were difficult, and I ended up, New College was a private school at the time, and I went to the guidance counselor, and I said, I need help with my psychedelic experiences. Again, this is early 1972, and the guidance counselor took me seriously. And through one of the most luckiest, fortuitous situations ever, the guidance counselor said that there was a book that he thought that I should read and that would be helpful to me. And it was Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research by Stan Groff. And what was so amazing is the book wasn't published till 1975. And so this guidance counselor had a manuscript copy, and he was in touch with Stan. So it was reading this book that talked about the science behind these kind of experiences, but it also had, and this is what I appreciate about Center for Mind Body Medicine too, that it had a reality check in it, which was therapy. Can you actually help people feel better and overcome trauma and overcome depression and addiction and other things through the use of these psychedelic supported experiences. Can you actually help people? So it wasn't like mysticism that goes on forever that speculates about another world. It was mysticism in the service of this world and of actually trying to help people. And so since everything was squashed, the backlash had happened, psychedelic research was shut down, and my parents were saying to me that they would make sure I never starved, and I always had a shelter and a place to stay and food no matter what I did. And they wanted me to be political. I said to my parents, this is now at age 18, I said, I want to drop out of college, I want to study LSD, and I want you to pay for it. And after a couple of months of turmoil, they agreed. And my father said something wonderful, which was one of the most important lessons of love I ever got, which was that he said he was convinced that I was making a mistake, but that I was a stubborn guy. And that if he didn't help me, it would take me longer to realize it was a mistake. And once I realized it was a mistake, I wouldn't want to admit it because then my parents would be right and I would have been wrong. So that if he helped me, then I would realize it was a mistake sooner. And he said he had a tiniest shred of doubt, maybe I actually knew what I needed to do.
Beautiful. That's great. What a great guy.
Yeah, it was incredible. And, the other part of it, just to say, is that he was, my grandparents, I mentioned, immigrated here. They were very poor. They had a bookstore in the Bronx. And my dad was an only child. And so the classic Jewish doctor story, he was the firstborn and the only born male child. And he was, from the time he was like 4 or 5 years old, he knew he had to be a doctor. That was the programming he got from his parents. And he loved being a doctor. But he wanted to raise his kids differently, that we would find out what we wanted to do and he would help us do that. Because he was programmed from a very early age. Even though the programming worked out well for him, he wanted us to find our own way.
Beautiful. So that opened you to these possibilities. You began your studies. What about starting MAPS? What made you decide to start an
okay, so in 1972, I did reach out to Stan. And this is another of those fortuitous things where he actually wrote me back. So I'm just an 18-year-old kid confused by psychedelics. He's, premier psychedelic researcher at Johns Hopkins. Their research is just being shut down. And so he told me about a workshop that he and Joan Halifax were giving shortly after they were married, like a week after they were married, at a place called the Man Ranch out in California. So I attended that with him. I did very much a month-long encounter group up in the mountains, California. I did 3-week primal therapy intensive. And all of these things were designed to kind of accelerate my development. But I really didn't appreciate integration. And so I was not happy where I was. I went back home and I realized that I needed to work on getting grounded and ended up having 10 years in the construction business, building things. My parents had a house designed by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright's that I grew up in. So I sort of saw things being built. And
Rick, one second. For people who don't know, Stan Groff is a Czech psychiatrist and he, Joan Halifax, who happens to be on my board of advisors for the Center for Mind Medicine, is a really good friend. That the two of them who were married at the time did the wonderful early research on the use of LSD with people who were dying or facing death. So I just wanted to provide that context. And Stan's books are enormously useful and rich and valuable.
Yeah, Stan is now 89 years old, and we've just published his sort of summation of his life's experience called The Way of the Psychonaut, Encyclopedia for Inner Journeys, 2-volume book, and we're just about to release the audio version as well. It's great. And
definitely want to take a look at that.
Yeah, and the book with Joan was The Human Encounter with Death. It was incredible. And so I spent 10 years getting grounded, and then I went back to college as a freshman at age 28, and the first thing I did was I wanted to design a curriculum to become a psychedelic therapist. And so I spent a month at Esalen with Stan and Christina Groff in a workshop called The Mystical Quest. And I was a work scholar. My job was I had to organize Stan's papers, which were incredible. And so I started developing this curriculum. But while I was there, I learned about MDMA. And so this relates to why I started MAPS. So I learned about MDMA when it was a drug called Adam, which was the nickname or code name for it being used by underground psychedelic therapists, which it had been since the late 1970s. And around 500,000 doses had been used under the name Atom. But a few of the people that had experienced it in this way decided that more people should have it, that they could make lots of money, and they turned it into ecstasy. And it was being used in public. And this was at a time of Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan and escalation of the drug war. And so it was clear that it was doomed, that it would eventually be criminalized because of this public use as ecstasy. But it wasn't criminalized yet. And so I realized I learned about LSD right after the backlash, sort of too late. And now I'm learning about MDMA before the backlash. So I thought, aha, this is an incredible opportunity to get involved, to try to protect it, to try to spread the word about it, to bring it to various people who would be reluctant to try it if it were illegal, but would be willing to try it if it were legal. And the key turning point for me was 1983, when I read a book by the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, a fellow named Robert Mueller, who was a French resistance fighter. And he wrote this book in 83 called New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality. And I reached out to him. And his thesis was similar to what motivated me when I was 18, that we have the United Nations mediate conflicts between countries, but a lot of these conflicts are religious-based. And we need to move people from fundamentalism to mysticism. And that mysticism is the antidote to fundamentalism, that you have these direct experiences. You don't need to be so literal about your mythologies, and also that the mystics of the different religions have more in common with each other than they do with the fundamentalists of their own religion. It was a beautiful book, but didn't say a word about psychedelics. So I wrote to him and I said, here's all the research. I talked about the Good Friday experiment that Timothy Leary and Walter Pankey had done in 1962, looking at whether psilocybin could produce mystical experiences, which they found that it did. And so I ended up writing to him and saying, would you help bring back psychedelic research? And here's a drug, MDMA. And he wrote me back also. And he introduced me to a bunch of mystics around the world. Brother David Steindl-Rast, who standard interest, Rabbi Salman Schachter, Wayne Teasdale from the Parliament of World Religions, Vanya Palmers, who's now from Switzerland, who's in charge of Zen there, Genro Kudela, various mystics. And I would send them MDMA, and they would use it as part of their meditation practice, usually in half doses, not full doses. And they would say that it would give them a certain kind of quiet focus that then after, without the MDMA, they could use to deepen their meditation practice. And they would report back to Robert Mueller about what they learned. And so that's where I started really getting political. And then in 84, when it was clear that ecstasy was getting more and more public attention, I started a nonprofit before MAPS, and that was to prepare to defend the therapeutic use of MDMA once the Drug Enforcement Administration would criminalize that, which they did in the end of July, the summer of 1984. And so I went to Washington. We filed for a DEA administrative law judge hearings. I just did an interview last week with Andy Weil, and it turned out that a friend of Andy's from Harvard was a big shot lawyer with a big DC law firm. And so Andy got him to represent us pro bono. So we had the firepower, and we were able to get this administrative law judge hearing. And while that was happening, we were doing great in the media. We were winning in the court of public opinion. We were winning in the courts, and the DEA freaked out. And in 1985, they did an emergency scheduling of MDMA before the hearing was even over. And then the next year, the judge came out and said it should be Schedule 3. So we won the hearing, and the head of the DEA rejected the recommendation.
Rick, explain what Schedule 1 versus Schedule 3 is so people understand.
Okay, yeah. So Schedule 1 is for drugs that have a high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, and no accepted safety for use under medical supervision. And it's the worst drugs. Now, of course, it's marijuana, it's LSD, and psilocybin. It's not necessarily the most dangerous drugs, but it's the ones that we have sort of said have no medical value, high potential for abuse, and it's what the drugs are often targeted by the drug war. And cocaine is actually in Schedule 2, because cocaine is used as a medicine for anesthesia, for nasal surgery, things like that. Methamphetamine is Schedule 2 and other schedules because it's available for attention deficit disorder for young kids. So anything that is moved from Schedule 1 through the FDA system and has been demonstrated to have safety and efficacy for a particular medical use gets moved out of Schedule 1. But it's very difficult to do research with Schedule 1 substances. The DEA makes it really hard. And so the psychedelics are all in Schedule 1. And marijuana still is in Schedule 1, although parts of marijuana, Epidiolex, which is CBD, has moved out. It's in Schedule 3, and THC for nausea control for cancer chemotherapy. But Schedule 1 drugs are very difficult to do research with, although it is possible. And so with this rejection of the recommendation that it be Schedule 3, it was clear to me at the time that we were going to lose eventually. We sued twice in the appeals courts and won because the DEA's rationale for rejecting the recommendation was flawed. But the third time around, the DEA lawyers finally figured out how to satisfy the courts. And so I felt like there's only one way through bringing MDMA back and bringing psychedelics back as legally available substances, and that's through the FDA. So I started MAPS in '86 as a nonprofit pharmaceutical company focused on psychedelics with our particular focus on MDMA. And luckily, I did not realize at the time that no drug had ever been made into a medicine by a nonprofit. That did finally happen in 1999, and that was the abortion pill, RU46. And it was funded by the Rockefellers. Warren Buffett was the main funder, and the Pritzker family and others. And so what happened, though, is in '87, I graduated New College, and I wanted to get a clinical psych PhD to learn how to do psychotherapy outcome research. But this was at a period of time where psychedelic research was blocked, and nobody could do research, which is why for my New College thesis, I did a follow-up to the Good Friday experiment, because it wasn't actually administering drugs, so I could get permission to do it. I was just asking people what they thought about their drug experience that was 25 years before. And so that was my first research, but I couldn't get into graduate school. Nobody would let me in. And so I realized while I was smoking marijuana, actually, I decided to smoke marijuana to figure out what do I do with my life now that I can't get into graduate school for a clinical psych PhD. And I had this insight, which I might have had other ways, but certainly I think the marijuana helped. And the insight was that I want too much too soon. This is this pattern. I'm impatient. I want too much too soon. I want to do the science, but the politics is in the way. And therefore, I need to go where the work really needs to be done, which is the politics. And so I had read an interview in Harper's Magazine with 3 drug policy experts, and one of them had mentioned our lawsuit against the DEA. And this guy, Mark Kleiman was his name, and he was at Harvard, the Kennedy School of Government, which I had never heard of before, either him or this school. But I called Mark up and I said, I need a mentor. I need to study the politics. I need to open up psychedelic research. Would you be my mentor if I could get in? And he said, sure, he would be glad to do that. And so I studied up really well for the GRAs and all this, and I managed to get into the Kennedy School in '88.
I want to stop you for one sec to speak to people in the audience, particularly younger people who are often so reticent about moving ahead with what feels really important to them. And I want to highlight what Rick is saying, that he found what was vitally important to him, ways that he thought he could really make a difference in the way the world, the way all of us looked at ourselves and looked at the world and could change it in a very positive way, could literally expand our consciousness. And once, as he began to develop his mission and he reached out to people, an amazing group of people were responsive. And that's been my experience too over the years, is that if you're really committed, really open, really ready to do something, there will be people that you will find who will support you. And so one of the reasons I'm very happy that you're here with me is to encourage, not only to talk about psychedelics and trauma, but to also to encourage people to have courage and to really follow. Joseph Campbell talked about following your bliss. Well, follow what is really vitally important to you, even if it seems kind of weird to the rest of the world. And if you do that with a with intelligence and an open heart, there are going to be people who will respond. But I just wanted to put that out there.
That's so important. The other thing I think I'd like to add is that when you're young and you look at the rest of your life, let's say when I was 18, it seems like you have infinite time. But when you're older and you look back, it's like, oh my God, that was just a blink of an eye. So for young people to have like a 20-year plan or a 30-year plan to build all your skills to get to where you want to be, it's not actually that long. It might seem super intimidating when you're young, but it's not. And before you know it, the 20-year future or the 30-year future will have arrived. And if you can plant seeds when you're young to get to where you want to go by that period of time, there's a good chance these seeds will blossom and you'll be where you want to be. And also just the struggle to be where you want to be is people talk about that all the time. It's the journey. You're there already.
I want to move ahead a little with where some of the seeds you've planted, how they've been growing. And so if you could talk a little bit about sort of kind of a capsule of what MAPS is about and what some of the most exciting things that you're doing now are.
Yeah. So, since MAPS is a nonprofit pharmaceutical company, and our strategy is really about the FDA, the FDA requires proof of safety and efficacy of a particular drug for a particular clinical condition in order for it to be approved. You don't have to understand how it works. You don't have to have mechanism of action research. It helps if you have an explanatory story, but it's not necessary. So over the history of MAPS since 1986, we've raised over $100 million in donations.
Amazing.
Yeah, and only 2.3 of that has actually been from state government, which was the state of Colorado, and that was for a marijuana PTSD study in veterans. The rest has all been private donors, and virtually none from the National Institute of Mental Health, from the NIH, from all these traditional sources. It's been from individuals or family foundations where we've gotten the money. So what we've done is prioritize. The first thing was a strategic analysis of all the different drugs, psychedelic drugs, and all the different conditions, which one was the most likely to make it through the FDA first. And so there's the classic psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, from peyote or San Pedro, ayahuasca, ibogaine, the ones that are sort of ego dissolution, more prone to these mystical experiences. And MDMA operates differently. It's not a classic psychedelic. It's not so much ego dissolution, but it's fear-reducing, self-acceptance, self-love, stimulates oxytocin and other, builds the therapeutic alliance. And so I felt that of all the psychedelics that...
Oxytocin is the bonding hormone that between mothers of nursing infants and also between people when they're coming close to each other, increases secretion of oxytocin. Just wanted to, for any viewers who are not tuned in yet to it.
Yeah, so it felt like that MDMA is the most gentle of all the psychedelics. It's the easiest to integrate because it's your ego is intact for a lot of it, although people do have spiritual mystical experiences under MDMA. But and also a big part of our approach was what we learned from the psychedelic researchers and others from the 60s and 50s, which is that the psychedelic researchers, if they're therapists, it would be helpful to them, although not essential, but helpful if they had done the drugs themselves. So they knew what they did. I mean, you wouldn't go to a meditation teacher that had never meditated or a yoga teacher that never did yoga. And with psychedelics, I think it's similar. The therapist, if they know what you're going through, they will be more empathic. They will be more helpful. And if they've done their own inner work to confront their own inner demons and their own fears and anxieties and know how hard that can be, they'll be more effective. So I felt like, first off, as I said, MDMA is the most gentle of the psychedelics, easiest to integrate, but also it's the easiest to get the psychiatrists and psychotherapists interested in trying it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there'd be more fear against the classic psychedelics because you really have to let go more. You're often, we confuse ego death with physical death. So people sometimes under classic psychedelics think they're dying because their normal frame of reference is going. All right. So then we needed a patient population that was sympathetic to the American public. that we were helping a patient, and we needed a patient population that sometimes this mental illness was fatal through suicides or other kind of problems like that, and also that the currently available treatments maybe helped some, but didn't help everybody, that there was a large amount of treatment-resistant people, that it was serious, potentially fatal, and that they were sympathetic, the patients. So MDMA is perfect for post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD changes your brain in certain ways. You have a hyperactive amygdala where we process fear, your reduction of activity in the prefrontal cortex where we think logically. So you're triggered by stuff. You can't separate out what's then and now. So I felt that MDMA for PTSD would be the combination that we would focus on. And so it took us 30 years from 1986 to 2016 to do the phase 1 and phase 2 studies, which are required to present to the FDA in what's called an end of phase 2 meeting. Phase 1 is basically safety studies. Phase 2 are studies where you start exploring in patient populations and you start figuring out what's your treatment, what's your dose, what are the side effects, what is the exclusion criteria, who can you include. You sort of sort it out in phase 2. And then phase 3 is the pivotal studies where you have to prove safety and efficacy, large-scale studies. So it took us 30 years to do all the fundraising, to get the permissions, to do the phase 1 and phase 2 studies, which we did in the United States, Israel, Switzerland, and Canada. And so November 29th, 2016, we went to the FDA and we said we would like permission to go to phase 3. And FDA said yes, that we were ready to do that. And we negotiated with FDA for another 8 months on what the design of phase 3 would be, what all the other studies that they want to see, animal studies as well as other human studies before we approved. And so we are now at this incredible moment where we have finished our first of 2 phase 3 studies. We agreed with FDA that we would do 2 studies for phase 3, each 100 persons, and a series of other studies that we would do. And FDA granted us breakthrough therapy, which was really important because breakthrough therapy is for the most promising drugs. And the FDA, if you are designated breakthrough therapy, Big Pharma really likes that, but 2/3 of their applications for breakthrough are rejected because they're not real breakthroughs. Mm-hmm. They're just, your stock goes up if you're a for-profit when you get breakthrough therapy, and you get shorter review times, more meetings with FDA. So we got breakthrough, we got special protocol assessment. We have an agreement letter with FDA that they will approve the drug if these studies get statistically significant evidence of efficacy and no new safety problems come. So in March, we had what's called the interim analysis of our first phase 3 study. And so what that means is that you can have an independent data monitoring committee take a look at the unblinded data and compare your actuals with the hypotheticals that you used for your statistical power calculations. And you have the option of adding to the study. So I'll just say briefly that the more people you have in a study, the easier it is to get statistical significance. You can rule out chance. You can find smaller and smaller effects with larger and larger number of subjects. Mm-hmm. So we sized our study based on our phase 2 data, which had a large effect size. And so we were a little bit conservative, but we said we wanted to have at the interim analysis a 90% or greater chance of statistical significance with at least a medium effect size. And so the interim analysis took place in March. There's only one other drug that the FDA has declared breakthrough for PTSD, and that was a repurposed sleeping pill from 30 years ago called Tonmya that was run by Tonix Pharmaceuticals. They had their interim analysis in March. They were phase 3 breakthrough, and they failed the interim analysis for futility after they'd spent well over $100 million. Now, our interim analysis in March was the opposite. We were told we didn't need to add anybody, that we had a 90% or greater chance of success. But that's right around the time of COVID, and things slowed down. And so the FDA reached out to us and to other sponsors, and they said, would you like to negotiate with us about ending your study sooner? The challenge is, if you end it with fewer people, it makes it harder to have statistical significance. But we reached agreement with FDA that we would end it with 90 people instead of 100. We got the last data point in August, and we are now doing the data cleansing, data lock, we'll have October 20th as when we're going to have the news whether our first study was statistically significant. So less than a month from now. We've already started our second phase 3 study in about 6 of the 14 sites. The rest are going to come online over the next couple of months due to delays due to COVID. And we've gone to Europe. We've negotiated with the European Medicines Agency, and they've said that they will accept all our U.S. data. We have to do one phase 3 study in Europe, and so we're starting the studies there to train the therapists. So we're in an incredible spot.
Fantastic. Give people. I mean, one of the things about you is that you have incredible perseverance, as well as perseverance, intelligence, and embracing a team of people to work with you. What about the clinical benefits? I've seen and heard from people who participated and used MDMA, people with PTSD. I wonder if you can tell our viewers something about it. Yes, you're seeing statistical significance so far. What does that mean clinically?
Well, in our phase 2 data that we presented to FDA about our plans to go to phase 3, what we showed is that we have 42 hours of therapy. There's 3 day-long MDMA experiences, or placebo, or therapy without MDMA. And there's 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions as well. So really, people need to think about this. This is psychotherapy that the MDMA facilitates. And we felt that we had to work with the hardest cases because of the stigma, because we needed to show it really worked. And so we work with chronic, on average, severe, treatment-resistant PTSD patients in phase 2. And what that means is that when you have severe PTSD, you are burdened by your memories from the past. Many of these people could not work. They would have nightmares, problems with sleeping. They would have difficult times leaving the house, being in public settings. They would be easily reminded of the trauma, easily triggered. They would have substance abuse problems. They would have either emotional numbing to try to block out any feelings, or they would have hyperreactivity. Everything would like set them up and set them off. And a noise, they wouldn't be able to separate out a noise from a car backfire from a bomb, or just somebody who looked like somebody who had assaulted them that was in a different context. They would still, so people are very impacted by PTSD when it's severe. And often we also felt that we needed to enroll people that had previously attempted suicide. That many PTSD studies say if you've previously attempted suicide, it's too dangerous for us to work with you, but we felt we had to work with the hardest cases. So what we showed is that after the therapy, we want to look 2 months after the last experimental session. And that's because we don't want people to say, oh, that's just a psychedelic afterglow. You know, you've done the MDMA and now it's, you know, making you feel better, but it's going to wear off and fade. And so we didn't want to look like 1 week after the last session or 2 weeks. We looked 2 months after the last session. And so what we showed is that 23% no longer had PTSD that had the therapy without active MDMA, which is really remarkably good for people that are treatment resistant.
Yes, it is.
And so what we showed, though, was that, first off, the therapists are really trying. You know, they can tell whether people get MDMA or not, but that they're really trying, and the therapy is pretty good. Then when you add MDMA, 56% no longer had PTSD. So clinically what that means is that they still may have some symptoms, but they don't rise to the level of a diagnosis of PTSD. And then the most important point is that we did a 1-year follow-up as well. And that's mostly for insurance companies to show that it's sustainable, if it is sustainable, to try to say that this is a heavy investment of resources at the very beginning, a lot of therapy. But you know, if it fades after a while, it's not worth it. But if it sustains, then it is. So the 1-year follow-up, what we showed is that 2/3 no longer had PTSD. And of the 1/3 that did, almost all of them had clinically significant reductions of PTSD symptoms. So what that means is that people weren't so easily triggered. They could sleep better. They had hope. They could go out more in public. So if those people that still had PTSD, if we could have given them one more session, maybe they would no longer have PTSD.
So what's so striking is that there's a change, there's a biochemical change, there's a psychological change, there's a spiritual change in terms of the way people look at the world, and that the combination of those changes puts them in a place where they can continue to adapt and change, which is so beautiful and so promising. And I want to point this out, which of course so different from the conventional use of psychotropic drugs, which focuses on symptoms, and once the drug is over, there's no more effect. This is fundamentally changing the way people look at the world. And I was most impressed in talking with some of the veterans who've worked with MAPS and who've experienced the MDMA and some of the psychedelics in their therapy, and just how significant those changes are, and how they seem not perfect by any means, but they're still sometimes very challenging. But they have an ability to deal with those challenges that they never had before, and a flexibility.
Yes, that's really important. I mean, one of the things that some neuroscientists at Johns Hopkins have learned is that in mice, that when you give MDMA to mice and it stimulates oxytocin, that it also promotes new neural connections in prosocial areas of the brain. So we are actually helping people rewire their brains and how they process traumatic memories. And I think that the key thing, as you said, is that it's not about suppressing symptoms. It's about bringing symptoms to the surface so that you can process them, like grief. A lot of times people are just wrapped up in sadness and grief. Once you can let it out and cry, it's not that grief has gone away, but you're not blocked by it. And so I think the people in the study, once they learn that these emotions that have been so tormenting to them that they feel they have to keep blocking because it would be overwhelming, once they have the fear reduction from MDMA and they can let the kind of emotions fully flower, even though, people spend a lot of time shaking, a lot of times crying. A lot of the vets and others have said, I don't know why they call this ecstasy, because it's difficult, but it's not just you take a pill and now you feel better. It's that you can let out the feelings. Once they learn that they can process this, they don't have to stuff their feelings down. They can do that on their own afterwards. And that's, I think, the part that makes it so healing and sustaining over time, is that they've learned how to deal with difficult emotions, and that they don't have to just be in this halfway state where they can't squash it, but it never goes away, and they can't really fully feel it because they feel that they'll be overwhelmed.
One of the reasons I think that what's happening is so beautiful, and I love the way you describe it, and it's very similar to the work we do with our groups, which is one of the reasons that we're talking about collaborating and bringing together work with groups, because it is painful to resolve the trauma. You have to go through it, and too many of the approaches have either forced people to go through it, which is not always helpful, or tried to suppress the symptoms. And what we're talking about and we're sharing is different ways through experiencing, bringing up what you need to experience, integrating it into yourself so that you're no longer, so that you feel a whole person, and then giving you the tools you need to move ahead with your life and to keep on growing. And I love the actual fact as well as the metaphor of those new neural connections that are happening.
Yeah. Well, there's also a measure that we use called the post-traumatic growth inventory. So it's possible to, for people that have been traumatized, to question what they're really doing with their lives. A lot of times if you've almost been killed and you've survived, that causes you to think, am I really doing what I most want to do in the short amount of time that I have? So that it is possible to grow from trauma. We think about it mostly as debilitating and it's painful, but there's a way to use trauma, if you're not overwhelmed by it, to reevaluate what your meaning and purpose is in life, and to actually do things that are more meaningful to you and have more purpose. And then you can actually grow from trauma.
It's exactly. And what, as I've talked with some of the people who've experienced MDA therapy, and as I think about our own work and our training programs and the groups we're doing around the world, it's a very similar sense, a sense of growth through the trauma, of being more whole, more responsive, more of who people are meant to be after, as they go through the trauma and beyond with the trauma, as they move into that phase of post-traumatic growth. So I think it's so crucial what you're doing.
Yeah, there's another kind of parallel in our work that I just think is worth mentioning now, which is that which is the work in children who are traumatized, and so many drugs are tested in adults, and then they're prescribed what's called off-label in children without any studies in children. So the FDA is now more requiring sponsors of research like MAPS, but not just like us, but others as well, to agree to what's called a phase 4 study. So phase 4 is post-approval. You still have to do some research, and that can expand who the drug can be for, or it can look at certain risky populations. And so we've already had to agree to FDA that if we succeed in adults, we have to do a big phase 3 study in 12 to 17-year-olds who are traumatized. And if that works, we have to do 7 to 11-year-olds. And when you think about all these refugees that are coming, or all these people that live in war zones, and what the impact is on children with their parents also traumatized. And I'll just mention that there was this, the same neuroscientist, Rick Doblin, that did the study in mice. She also did a study in octopuses. And octopuses are solitary creatures. And when they are in the wild, they don't like other octopuses unless it's mating season, which isn't that long. And so what she thought is, what happens if we give MDMA to octopuses? Because they do process serotonin. And they diverged from humans over 550 million years ago. They have different kinds of brains, but they do process serotonin. As it turns out, you give octopuses MDMA and they want to hug other octopuses. And so the reason I mention that now, and it's incredible, there's you can just do MDMA octopus study and you'll find it. But what that means is that the pro-social, open-hearted aspects of MDMA are pre-verbal. And that's why I think it would work with children. So the work that you've done in Gaza and Israel with children who've been traumatized, I think that's so important. And we're hoping to sort of do that as well with MDMA, because if you wait till people are adults and they've gone through all of adolescence traumatized, it just makes it worse for them and harder. If you can help them when they're young, it's more important than helping them later. And also it may be less expensive to help them when they're young too.
Rick, we can talk and all afternoon and well into the evening. So we're just have about 10 minutes more. So I want to kind of bring things together and also say we've got to do this again, both in person and on the screen. But I want you a couple things. One is the kids here in the United States are in many ways, many of these kids are in much worse shape than those refugee kids. The kids here in families that have experienced poverty and abuse and inequity and racism are really in that. So I just wanted to bring that out, that our work is with kids in war zones. In many ways, those kids have it easier because many of them have had very good, solid families. They have a community that's supportive. Here in the United States, there's so much fragmentation. There's so much separation. We don't have those conjoint or extended families anymore. And there's, the distinctions, as you well know, between rich and poor in this country are punishing.
Yes, terrible.
To everyone. So I just wanted to bring that up. I want to ask you to reflect on the larger context in which we're operating right now. But first, I want to ask, there are a couple of questions that I just want to pose to you from people who are asking about them. And then we'll take the larger context, and then we'll have to come to a close, and then we'll come back for a reunion in a few months.
Okay, I love that. Yeah.
So the first question, I'm interested in trying psychedelic-assisted therapy, but I don't know where to start or who I can trust. Do you have any advice?
Well, if you want to volunteer for a study, the thing to do is to go to clinicaltrials.gov, which is a list of all the active studies, not just in the United States, but around the world. And you can put in a particular condition or a condition and a drug, and you will find out what studies are there. Now, there are a whole network of underground psychedelic therapists as well. I can't really give good advice on how to contact them, because it's so delicate. It's really word of mouth. There are opportunities to go to Amsterdam for mushroom experiences. There's opportunities to go to Mexico for ibogaine, or to go to South America for ayahuasca. There's ayahuasca churches throughout the United States that people could sort of look for. There's the Peyote Way Church of God, which is in Texas, where you can go and have a guy. It's sort of, they set you up for a personal vision quest, and they're very sincere about what they do. And they're part of the Native American Church, the Peyote Way Church of God. There are other groups that offer ayahuasca you can find on the internet. I do think that having these experiences with trained therapists and guides is really important. It's going to be more likely to turn out well. The other big thing, though, for us is that we are working on drug policy reform. So we think that it's a human right to explore your consciousness, and that these drugs should not be illegal in the first place. There should be a licensed legalization system. And that, I think, will happen in 2035. And we can talk about that maybe next time, how we'll get there. But the idea is that we want people to be able to have their own experiences through peer support. We're training. We have the Zendo project you can look at, which is to do peer support for people with difficult trips at Burning Man and other kind of festivals all over there. We even have a contract now with the Boston police, not Boston, Denver police, where Denver has made mushrooms the lowest enforcement priority. So our Zendo people are going to be training the Denver police on how to de-escalate situations if they come across people with difficult mushroom experiences.
Beautiful. Yeah, though sometime we can talk. I began working with people with complicated psychedelic experiences in 1967. So I have a long history. And we'll talk more about that next time. We can get together and explore. Yeah. And I know I'm talking with a woman who's in charge of the Zendo project as well.
Oh, good. The other thing I'll add, I think, is the holotropic breathwork. Stan Groff has developed a non-drug way to have experiences that are like classic psychedelic experiences through hyperventilation. And so you can look, there's networks of holotropic breathwork practitioners throughout the world and throughout the United States, and they can be very helpful.
Great. Thank you. Next question. Microdosing has gained a lot of popularity over the past few years. Can you please explain what it is and the benefits and the downside?
Yeah, well, microdosing is basically this idea that it's mostly for classic psychedelics, that you use doses that are below the doses that will produce any kind of visual distortions or even any kind of psychedelic experiences. So microdose really means below the level of awareness, but it's for increasing concentration, lifting mood, creativity. I think that in general, when people have psychological issues that they're working on, either clinical conditions, anxiety, depression, fear of death, PTSD, social anxiety, any number of different things, I would much rather people do macrodosing, would do full dose with therapists with the goal of getting to the core of the problems and then not needing drugs. Microdosing, for those people that have used it for depression or other things, they tend to use it on a frequent basis for a long time. So it's more like a different approach to traditional antidepressant medicines. But I think microdosing for creativity, for energy, for enjoyment, for listening to music, things like that, I think it's really good for. There was one study, the Elucis Benefit Corporation was a for-profit benefit corp set up to look at microdosing, and they did a whole series of intellectual challenge tests for people that were placebo or microdosing, and they couldn't see a difference. But they felt that was because there was a ceiling effect, that the people that volunteered were already pretty good and that they would max out on these scores whether they had placebo or not. So I do know people that feel like the microdosing has helped them a lot for a wide range of things. Jim Fadiman, Fadiman, is sort of the expert in gathering all sorts of reports from microdosing. And so I think it's an important new development. And it's worth a lot further exploration, but I don't see it as likely to have great potential for clinical indications, but for other indications, uses.
Just kind of bringing things to a close, do you want to reflect on why the work that you're doing now, which you began in 1972, what's changed, and even more important, why is it so important right now in this particular time in our history?
Well, right now, humanity is on a course of destruction. I mean, we're destroying the environment. We're causing all sorts of animals to go extinct and plants. And um, we're not healthy. As a collective species, we're not healthy. And there's so much trauma that we carry that people are unable to see past the trauma. And there's a rise of authoritarianism, a rise of prejudice, a rise of dehumanizing others. People are not that sympathetic with all the refugees that are running through Europe and elsewhere. We're against immigrants. So what's happening is through globalization, through the internet, groups that were more or less separate from each other are bumping up against each other all the time now. And so I think what we really need to survive is we need to move beyond the normal ways that we have differentiated ourselves from others, the tribalism, the by gender or race or, skin color or religion or nationality or socioeconomic status. We need to be grounded in the fact that we're all in it together, and that we need to find collective solutions, which at the same time will promote individuality. I think that's the paradox for a lot of people. They think that this understanding of our commonality washes away the differences. But in fact, it highlights the differences, but you can appreciate them more so that we can have both deeper collectivity and more individuality. And I think we're at a cultural transition where the humanity is survival is at risk like never before. And so I think we need these collective experiences. And, we've had astronauts who've gone up in space and talk about looking at the Earth from space and how that's fundamentally changed them. Edgar Mitchell then started the Institute for Noetic Sciences, about this. And so I think it's a lot cheaper to give people psychedelics than to shoot them up in space. And so that's why this work is so important right now.
I agree with you, Rick. And that's one of the reasons why my interest, which I've always had since actually 1963, I've had interest, but now it's really coming to the fore because I agree with you. This is a critical time, and these substances, most of them natural substances, but all of these substances are part of healing ourselves and will help us to heal the planet potentially.
And we kind of owe you a debt of gratitude, because I think what has made the psychedelic renaissance so possible is that, you just talked about knowing about the value of psychedelics since 1963. When the 60s happened, the culture wasn't ready, not just for the psychedelics, but for what emerged. The Beatles had to bring back these people in, silly costumes, teaching people about meditation. There was a big fear about yoga, that it would be a foreign religion. We didn't talk about death. It was all hidden. The first hospice in the United States was until 1974. Women were tranquilized to give birth. Men weren't allowed in the delivery room. But now, over the last 50 years, mindfulness has been accepted. You can go to the YMCA and learn yoga. And so we have, as a culture, have integrated a lot of the experiences that were very problematic when they first emerged in the 60s. And we've integrated everything now except for the psychedelics. And so now we're building on the work that's been done with meditation, mindfulness, yoga, hospice centers, birthing centers, to now weave back in the psychedelics.
Beautiful. Rick, how can people learn more about MAPS and more about what you're doing? Can you give them a website? And we'll put it up on a slide too, but maybe you can tell people.
Yeah, maps.org, maps.org. And our website has enormous amounts of information. We've had big conferences about psychedelics. The videotapes are all up there. We also have our protocols that are posted, our treatment manual about how we do therapy. You go to the research section, MDMA, down at the bottom of the page is the MDMA treatment manual. We have a policy of transparency, of sharing, again, because it's nonprofit. Drug development, we want other people to adopt and adapt and innovate. So the maps.org website will bring you an enormous amount of information.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for your perseverance, your vision, and your generosity, which keeps growing. We're going to sit just for a minute and breathe together, and then we'll close the session. And that's a siren outside telling us the time is to close. And I'm very much looking forward to our next conversation as well. So let's sit comfortably together and breathe together. And just as we relax with each other, I hope this has been a really good session for all of you who are watching, feeling the connection to yourself, as you breathe, to everyone who is concerned about healing themselves and healing the planet, and to this extraordinary work that Rick and his colleagues have helped to catalyze. Just relaxing with each breath. Okay, let's open our eyes and come back in the room. We're going to close now, and Rick and I may stay on for just a minute or two afterwards, just to chat. And thank you again, everybody, for being with us. Thanks, Rick. Beautiful.
My pleasure. Thank you.